Okay, so hi, welcome back. Haven't done so many podcasts of late, but I came across Ramon, who I think we did some sessions we were just discussing some years ago, something like that, and it looked like he got a lot of cool stuff going on over on the other side of the world from me, I think in Hawaii. So I just want to welcome you to this. I usually call this show Talking Therapy, and say hi and invite you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your journey, who you are, and what you offer.
Yeah, well, I appreciate being here, Debraja. As I said earlier, I have a ton of respect for your work, and I have been engaging with your teachings on bioenergetics for easily over 8 or 9 years now, something like that. I think from when your channel was almost new. I don't recall, but yeah, I've been following it for a long time, and I really appreciate being here with you. So yeah, well, my name is Ramon Castellanos, and I was born in Miami, Florida, to an Afro-Cuban, I guess, lineage and tradition. And so, my exposure to this type of work started really young because where I grew up, we were practicing a shamanic tradition that came from Africa to Cuba with the slave trade. And so I was initiated into that tradition when I was really, really young. And so I grew up, with some kind of interest in, I guess, what we might call the human spirit, right, the human soul. And that started really, really early on. When I turned about 17 years old, something along those lines, I started meditating and engaging with energy work and doing all of that type of all that type of stuff. And I ended up inadvertently triggering a very intense and very disruptive and devastating Kundalini awakening. I was working with Osho's dynamic meditation at the time too, and it just completely, blew my circuits, so to speak, which then sent me on a very long term process of getting all of that reconciled and stabilized. I also, a part of that time was also spent living and working at a wolf sanctuary in the wilderness of New Mexico for over a decade, working with wild animals. And that's when you and me were working together, when I was living and working at the sanctuary. Very challenging time. And yeah, now all of those big experiences to give like the highlights. I'm a teacher, a guide, and a facilitator at this point, and I work on a few different threads of practice. One of them is health and healing, helping people wherever they're at in that process. Another part of that is ancestral reconnection, right? Connecting to ancestors from a long, deep time perspective, right? So the human ancestry as opposed necessarily to just your ancestors. And also I work with what I call destiny, right? Helping people find this sense, this deeper sense of what they came here to give as a soul. And all that gets wrapped together with practice, right? The art of practice, which I think is one of the articles that you maybe read, was me riffing on an aspect of practice, because none of that comes together without having consistent practice of some form or another. Yeah. So that's, I work one-on-one with people at the moment, and also my Substack is available for people to join. So that's kind of like the big picture view of who I am and what I do.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I mean, yeah, I was intrigued. Maybe you can expand. I don't know if you feel to expand a little bit. You said like you were kind of brought up from your family. I take it, in a kind of spiritual tradition of some sort from Cuba. Is that what I heard?
Yeah. So yeah, I would love to expand on that. So in Africa, there are many traditions, right, that have been shamanically orientated for thousands of years. When you actually look at the history of it, it's probably older than a lot of the stuff you find in the East, right? So we have like these late Paleolithic era traditions that have survived for easily 8 to 10,000 years in Africa, unbroken, right? These living traditions, which is super cool. And so when the Africans came, specifically the Yoruba people of Nigeria, when they came to Cuba and they were brought in as slaves, they carried with them these traditions. And so in Cuba, there was this eclectic mixing of certain African aspects of shamanic practice and also Catholicism. And the reason for the Catholicism was more like a Trojan horse operation. The slaves, they would hide their practices under the guise of Catholic tradition because the slave owners were Catholic. And so in Cuba, there's this really rich and beautiful tradition that is called Lukumi, which is has a lot of divination in it, dance, trance states, drumming, all sorts of musical consciousness shifting processes. This very intense but somatically orientated deity worship, right? Or even working with deities. And these invocation processes where you're trying to really feel the essence of the deity moving through the body as opposed to necessarily just like mentally connecting. And it's a really rich and beautiful tradition. It lost certain elements of what you find in Africa, for sure, because as you get the slave trade, things just change. And that's the tradition I grew up in called Lukumi, right? Some people call it Santeria, but that's really not the best name for it. It's more Lukumi. And so yeah, that's the tradition I grew up in because my grandmother, she was devoted to that tradition. That's what she did for work, actually. My grandmother was, I guess, if you were looking for a word that could encompass everything she did, it would probably be medicine woman, though that was not necessarily a title that she was given or used. But that's what she did, right? I grew up with my grandmother. That's what I learned growing up. So I was learning how to do magic from a really young age, right? Wow. Sacrificing animals when I was probably like 6 or 7 because animal sacrifice is actually a part of that tradition. I don't really do that now, right? I don't engage with the animal sacrifice because I'm not as deeply immersed in the traditional aspects of that tradition anymore. But a lot of what I learned has made it into my practice. But yeah, I mean, so I was doing all that stuff from a really, really young age.
Wow, wow. I mean, it's really, I mean, I find that amazing, being brought up in the West, because like, my exposure to religion from my parents, adopted parents, was like just like, you get dragged along to a kind of church and shit, and it's really cold and boring, I mean, how was it for you actually? What was there aspects of it as a kid, like with your grandmother, like was it all exciting or was it also like, do we have to do this Santeria stuff again, sort of thing? Or was it like, well, I don't know, how was it? Can you remember? Like
Yeah,
when you
I
were
can.
young?
Yeah, it wasn't like that at all, actually. It was in some ways exciting and powerful. I mean, so I got initiated into the tradition when I was a year and a half old, which is uncommon, right? Because most of the time people get initiated into this tradition when they're older. I got initiated because apparently I was having the story I'm told, so to speak, was that there was some sort of health problems going on with me as a baby, and so I was initiated in order to, save my life, right? And the initiations are super deep and super long, like so they're like they take a whole year of your life. They take 20 or 30 people to complete. I mean, it's really like an intensive somatic process, right? Where you're put through all these different very physically orientated rituals with song and dance and it's really beautiful. Your body gets painted and washed over and over again. I mean, it's really fascinating. And so I was exposed to that type of really rich experience all of the time when we were engaging the tradition. So it wasn't like, oh, let's go to church and just sit in this cold, as you said, this cold place that's divorced, right? Like the divine is over there, far away from you on the wall. It's more like the divine is imminent right here and now. Whenever we were doing the work, there was often smoke and incense and candles and animals that were being sacrificed and songs that were being sung and either drumming on something or taking like big staffs and hitting the ground. So it was always really engaging, and we were calling spirits in order to work with spirits. So when you're engaged in something like that, it's difficult for it to be boring. You know what I mean? It's very
mm,
engaging.
mm,
Yeah.
mm,
There were aspects of it too that often included work, right? So uh, having to take, so one of the ways that they divine in this tradition, do divinations, is that they take a coconut, they crack it open, they take the coconut and cut it into pieces, and so then 4 pieces of coconut are used in this binary yes and no type of uh, direct engagement with spirits, right? And so, a part of being a young person in that tradition is often having to crack open coconuts, right? With the hard shell, you have to crack them open and cut them and prepare them for the elders. Or you have to do like the sweeping, or you have to, get the animals and bring them in, or you have to help prepare the food. So whenever there was big engagements that way, it was bustling. There was a community event. Everybody was involved in preparing for what was happening and cleaning up and getting everything ready. So very engaging. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I mean, like, so now when you look at your life now, it's like this has really impacted you. Do you think this has really made you who you are, or did you kind of I don't know, did you then when you became like a teenager or older move away from it, do your own thing, then come back into shamanism, or how does it feel for you now as an adult? This childhood that you had, how much has it impacted the person you are today?
Yeah, well, it's impacted me greatly. So, I mean, yeah, when I turned 17 and I decided to start meditating and doing energy work and doing Taoist internal alchemy practices that led to my inadvertent Kundalini awakening, I did leave the tradition at the time. And I mean, I was a teenager. Teenagers rebel against the religions that they're born in, often, right? Especially in the West. It's a very common pattern. So I did the same thing. And so I ended up leaving the tradition for any number of reasons. And uh, when I turned about 27, 28, maybe 26, something along those lines, I decided that I wanted to start getting back into the tradition. And so I did that for about 3 to 4 years, and I started to work with the deities again, started doing the divination process again, started to really try to understand the core spiritual principles transmitted in Africa more so than in Cuba. I really wanted to go back to the roots
Mhm.
of it. And I learned a little bit. That tradition is so vast that you could study it for lifetimes and never get all of it. So I will say that I learned a little bit, even though I was full on devoted for about 3 to 4 years. And after about that period of time, I realized that the tradition in that manner was just not for me. Like, it's not something that felt deeply true in the sense of it being a practice that I wanted to live the rest of my life doing. Right? It's a very engaged practice. It takes a lot of devotion. It really also, if you're going to do it properly, it often takes a lot of your um, practice bandwidth, right? Like the bandwidth that you have for practice in general has to be devoted to that tradition. It's a very intensive tradition. It's a very beautiful and powerful tradition. Um, but I would say that it shaped me in terms of my orientation towards animism, shamanic practice, and in some ways, just from the beginning, being exposed to the other than directly physical aspects of reality. And so in a lot of ways, I don't use this term a lot because it's a tricky term to use. But I would consider that what I do is I'm a shamanic practitioner, right? And everything else I do falls underneath that. But I don't necessarily use that word a lot because the word shamanic practitioner and shaman and all that stuff is very um, has been abused a lot. So I find it easier to not talk about it. But um, that all of that absolutely impacted the way that I approach things now. I would say it's not. I could not be who I am, yeah, without that upbringing. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. So
Does that
you've
answer
really
your
been like,
question?
sorry, I mean, I just like you've really been like immersed. When I look back at my own life, I didn't really get into spiritual stuff until my late 30s, and like I mean, I did have like a kind of awakening thing, and I had some really heavy experiences around drugs and shit, recreational drugs, and very powerful shit happened to me, but it was not framed in any kind of spiritual context in my own mind. And I didn't really get interested in stuff till I was in my late 30s. And I guess for you, you've just been in this scene your whole life, like pretty much from coming out of your mother, like it's pretty, yeah, it's fascinating. And like,
Yeah, I suppose
I
so.
guess with
Yeah.
shamanism, I mean, it often conjures up the idea, I suppose, of someone who's working with like spiritual entities in some kind of mediation role to produce some kind of healing or ameliorative effect in clients or whatever, something like this, or that they're channeling, energies down into into a group or something like this. Is this kind of how you see it yourself, or do you expand on it a little bit more, something different or whatever?
Uh, that's a part of what I do in the context of working primarily with ancestors, right? So a part of what I do is teach an ancestral lineage repair process and how to work with ancestors. So that does usually involve me engaging directly with ancestral forces. I really do relate to them primarily as ancestral forces, as necessarily and not necessarily as an individual ancestor most of the time. It's more about this deep somatic sense of connecting to this deeper story, these deeper genetic imprints, and the almost like the impulse of life itself to to move life forward, right? The ancestral lines are really deeply invested in us being here and thriving. It's like it's like one of the purposes of life itself. So I do work in that context. I would say that I more so teach and help people do the work as opposed to try to directly facilitate healing through like a shamanic process. Uh, because it's more of how I'm orientated. So I do engage with spirits and uh, do that. But so for me, the role of the shaman is really and I'm not saying I'm a shaman, right? Because I think that's a role that other people have to give you. That's like a title that other people have to give you. I'm a shamanic practitioner, which means that I just engage with these practices and skills in order to perform a function and a role in the context of a community, right? Like in the context of the human body, so to speak, right? The shamanic practitioner in contemporary times has a role, has a function, right? Like any role and function. And so for me, that role is largely characterized by taking pieces that have been either torn apart or broken apart and weaving them back together into a unified whole, right? Into an integrated unified whole. And so that could show up in the context of one-on-one work that involves talking about someone's hormones or how to help them through a bioenergetic context with practices, or it could show up in helping them find a thread of their destiny, or it could show up in dealing with karmic imprints that they've acquired. It really doesn't matter, right? It's more about this, for me anyway, as a practitioner, it's more about this big picture view of the human being and how can we find what is desynchronized in their being, what is disintegrated, and reintegrated, reconnected, reattune the instrument, so to speak, to play more harmoniously and symphonically. And so that could take on a lot of different forms. Today's world also requires a different type of medicine, right? So the context of shamanic practitioner or shaman or whatever in 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, even a couple hundred years ago, is very different than modern times, right? We have different types of wounds, and so we need a different type of medicine. So it takes on a different form, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's relevant to the times. I will also add, it's not a role that I sought out or even that I wanted in a lot of ways. It's more one that has been that I have been asked to carry out in a lot of ways. So yeah. resistance to doing it for a long time. Yeah. Anyway.
So you're a little bit of a kind of reluctant shaman practicer. You've been kind of like one of those movies where the tough guy has given up being a tough guy, but he's dragged back in to work or something. You know, those kind of films. I don't.
I don't know, man. I guess. Yeah. It's more of just like accepting what life has prepared me for and what life has asked me to do, and acknowledging my innate talents and gifts, and not trying to build an identity around something else, and just like letting it be what it is, right? So there's been elements of surrender for it for me, but yeah.
And what do you? I'm intrigued. What? So if someone's coming to you for a session or something like that, they're reaching out by email or whatever, messaging, then what do you actually do in sessions? What do you what's your kind of format or structure, or what's your approach?
Yeah, so it depends on what the person's trying to do with me. So right now I have two different ways of working with me. One is called shape-shifting stories, and the other is alchemizing health, right? And so alchemizing health is uh, it's basically a 6 to 7 month process. It was 6 months. I just changed it to 7, but so when someone shows up with that, I'm trying to get to know who they are and what they are, what their soul, right? So I'm listening deeply, right, for what the soul is saying that it wants to focus on for the coming months. So it could be, for example, that a person has a really strong disconnection from the earth, for example, or from their guts and their root system, and that they have built an identity and a personality that is very cerebrally orientated, and that everything is like, let's go up here. And so I can feel, based off of what they're saying and how they're showing up and what they're asking for and what their problems are, that that's like the big wound that they want to address. So once I understand that, then I will start to direct as many practices as they can manage in that moment towards shifting that, right? And at the same time, I will start to speak to them about an underlying cosmology that allows for those changes to occur. So a lot of people will have stories about, oh, I can't have that type of rooted groundedness in the world because then people won't accept me, or it's the wrong thing to do, or I can't really be a man because, that's not what's cool or acceptable, or whatever. People build so many different stories. So a part of it for me is address the stories, address the perceptive capacity, their perceptive lens, through direct conversation, and then give them practices that will begin to shift that on a very palpable level. And then give them feedback on the practices, and then troubleshoot when problems come up. Because, when people start to create serious change, usually their life will respond. And often, depending on how deeply they have built an identity and a life based off their wound, that can be a very big disruption. Where all of a sudden people start just treat you differently, weird things start to happen, synchronicities start to occur, people get fired, like things happen. It's just really intense. And so then how do we troubleshoot? How do we navigate? How do we adjust and refine throughout that process? Usually what I encounter too is that in the context of us working together, there's kind of like a peak. There's like a peak where everything that they've wanted to do comes to like this imminent intensity. And so then how do we transition through that peak and take advantage of it to create a catalytic shift in their being, in order to move them more towards wholeness, integration, synchronization, etc. So that's like the focus of alchemizing health, is integrating, bringing wholeness together, to unlock like this deeper whole being health, that only like that the soul can deliver, right? Disembodiment, as you know, is often, the consciousness pulling out of the body, right? And what makes the body truly healthy and vibrant is having that consciousness deeply in the body, like a sponge that sucks in water. And so for me, that's usually a big part of it. And I take as many tools as I can from any thread of the organism to get them there. Yeah. So does that make sense?
I get an idea. I get an idea. Yeah. Thank you. I
Yeah.
guess, I mean, one of that's always been like one of the, I started off super dissociated from the body and just really out. And, I had a really intense acid LSD experience when I was in my 20s, and that freaked me out a lot. And then I kind of withdrew a bit from life and more and outgoing so much. And then I had this kind of Kundalini experience in my 30s, early 30s. And then that just kind of disappeared because I was so not understanding what was going on. I was nothing to do with that kind of a spiritual scene. And overall, I just came a long way out of my body, and then over the last 10 years, it's just been a slowly coming back in. But I guess one of the things I see is like it's easy to get into what am I trying to say here? The mindset that, you should just be in the body, which because I think generally in the West, we are so far out, and it's been getting worse with screens and phones and everything, But like at the same time, I mean, how do you see it functioning with spirituality or spiritual entities? Because it strikes me we are coming out into some abstract world where we're getting something or channeling something or communicating with some agent externally. And then that is a dissociative move as I see it. And then we're coming back in, to the body and coming back down again. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. So for one, it has to be understood by people who are interested in this type of work that when you look at the environment that these types of shamanic practices evolved within over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, you were looking at a people who were deeply already very grounded and very immersed in physicality because they lived in the wilderness. And
Mhm.
so they were always already, climbing trees, hunting, dancing. They didn't have the same sexual hangups that we do. They aren't as armored as we are when you look at tribal hunter-gatherer civilizations just living out in nature.
Mm.
They and this was generation after generation after generation. And so even genetically, their bodies were often very full of vibrancy and vitality. And so the context that those practices evolved in was like, oh, we're already like deeply physicalized, so this movement towards spirit in some ways was happening in that context, right? So the challenge with that is that those types of experiences where we're engaging with this other than physical world, so to speak, is a part of being human. As far as I can tell, it shows up in every culture on earth, right? Like if it wasn't a part of being human, it wouldn't show up in every single culture. It doesn't matter where, right? Everywhere from Alaska to Australia, right? It's everywhere. And the issue though is that because humans, as you said, are so divorced from their physicality, a part of what in my perception has to be done in order to healthfully integrate those practices is to reverse engineer, as a lot of us do, this deeper grounding that helps people first reassociate and address the wounds that they're not addressing that are in the body, right? And to create the ability to generate flow in the body, right? So uh, and to be able to feel as if being in the body is safe and appropriate and home base. And then from that home base, from that deeper stability, then we can engage these other layers. Uh, Also, the way that I teach it, generally speaking, it's also very somatically orientated. I'm not generally, so it's more, it's a process that is more in the body. So it's about the body's relationship to these forces in some senses. More so than the trying to completely divorce and or astral project and or shoot the being out of the body. It's more about being able to have a body that can sense spiritual forces, that can deeply relate to spiritual forces, that can allow them to move through the body in a manner of speaking, in order for it to be more anchored in reality. So that's how I orientate it. I do think that that's not the only way that people orientate it. But the way that I see it is that a lot of us, we have to, if we want to do this in a healthy and even contextually appropriate way, is reattune to the body first, ground, stabilize, deal with the deeper wounds that are coming up in the physicality, and then from that place allow for this other than physical experience, so to speak, to emerge from that place. So it's a bit tricky too, because some people, they have a natural propensity, or you could say possibly it's if you were looking at from a typology, like a character structure perspective, some people maybe have a very strong leaving structure, and so they have this gift for being able to tune into these realms. Well, yeah, well, how do we then feed both sides and keep it moving together harmoniously? It depends on the person, right? I don't think necessarily that all humans are going to have the same degree of interest in the other than physical, and that's okay, right? It just depends on where someone's at and what is appropriate for them. Yeah.
It's curious. I mean, just you just saying that, because like I live in Istanbul these days, and like my Turkish is pretty bad, but I go out to some, I meet a lot of corporate people because I often go to this corporate meetup, and I mean, it's curious to me, like especially just how many women who work corporate in Turkey, Turkish women, and Arab, and like they're just super into anything spiritual, they're just like totally into it, it's like, I just meet women and they're like, oh yeah, I'm a cosmic healer, and oh, do you do that for a living? And, oh no, I'm head of marketing for some textile company based in Saudi Arabia or something. But like, it's just fascinating just how many people, especially in the corporate scene, are just secretly into spiritual stuff, especially women in the corporate scene. It just reminds me of just how endemic it is. It's like people are really interested in this shit, and you wouldn't think that to look at them so much. They're not wearing some long purple robe and stuff, but they're just massively into, I mean, not so much heavy body-based therapy stuff, but more cosmic chakra kind of things. It's kind of intriguing.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard that a couple of times, that often people say that it's the women who like come to them a lot. And yet I know that like your work has a lot of men that that gravitate towards it, right? Young guys,
Well, I think that, I mean it's because I became kind of a bit more famous on YouTube, because I started a channel about 2016 with bio, and because no one else was really doing it, this guy Elliot Hulse, who's a cool guy, I know him a bit, he was talking about bio, and he's a big bodybuilder character in South Florida, but like he was not really showing any exercises, and I thought, well, I've done some training in it, so I'll start that, and I just kept going with it because there wasn't anybody else. But because YouTube is so kind of skewed towards guys, a lot of guys were then coming towards me, but in a lot of my therapeutic work, it's equally with women as well, so
Okay.
it's like, I mean, and with bio, what was always intriguing to me, when I was living in a spiritual community, Osho community, nearly 20 years in the UK, and whenever women would start to get into bio, because it wasn't their first choice, it's like, nah, this looks horrible and tough, blah blah blah. But when the women start to get into it, they would stick with it more than the guys. I generally found a little bit more, a little bit more. They have a certain kind of core strength somewhere, women, but when they start to access it, probably because genetically they're the ones that have babies and carry the line of humans and stuff like that. they have a kind of core strength. And once they get into bio a bit, it's like, whoa, this shit can really change me. They'll kind of dig in, and so I've always been around a lot of women in the scene, and also being in the Osho scene, it was like it's super matriarchy. It's like really matriarchal. And it's like it's
Okay.
all the power roles usually are occupied by women,
Huh.
and it's really really different. From living in the world which is 99.99% pure patriarchy. So it's like really fucking different. So I feel like on some level I've always been tuned into the feminine side quite a lot, and then I do get to work with quite a lot of women as well because of this. But I also treasure the masculine side too. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm just putting that out. But
Sure. Yeah.
you think you work a lot more with guys than women, or opposite, or about the same?
There seems to be a little bit more of a skew towards men. Something like 70-30. Uh, at least at the moment, I'm more than open to have more women, right, show up and do work together. Um, I'm not really sure why. I mean, a part of one of my skill sets that I help guys with is testosterone, right? Like that's um, so maybe that's why sometimes men gravitate towards it. I don't know, but it's just from purely from a hormonal health standpoint, right? Because I was born with a flat pituitary gland, and one of the things that I had to do when I was 13 years old was get hormone replacement therapy just to jumpstart my puberty. So that
Mhm.
all was something that I've had to deal with too, is hormonal health stuff. So I don't know if that's like a factor that attracts a lot of guys, but I also help women with their hormones too, right? So I guess I don't know. It just I'm not
Mhm.
sure why, but it is what it is. Yeah. But I definitely am very comfortable working with both the feminine and the masculine. I was raised by my grandmother, with and also next to my mom and my sister. So I didn't really even have male figures growing up, right? I was very exposed to the feminine also. Uh, and so, yeah,
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah. What else am I thinking? I mean, like just you mentioning, like there's this kind of, I often read these days that, testosterone is going down in men. There's this sort of, see, I don't know if that's across the board in all countries and races or whatever, but that's kind of weird, and like, I don't know. It seems like the world is really fucking changing a lot. I don't know. That's just my perception. Do you have a similar perception, or you're not so bothered about it, or what's your take?
you mean in terms of like testosterone
Just the
or
world's sort of changing, it just seems like it's really changing at the minute to me.
yeah, I it does seem to be drastically changing in a very more towards what I would say is um, a type of unification consciousness that I think also um, could potentially show up in ways that people are not foreseeing, right? Because you say unification and that sounds great, until you realize that like fascist and totalitarian agendas are unitarian are unitarian in their orientation. Um, I do see also a suppression of uh, masculinity, and I mean that not like on a not necessarily on a men level per se, but just in general, as a force. Like if we were to divorce masculinity from gender and just look at it as like a archetypal force, I do see a deeper suppression of those types of characteristics on the popular in the popular sphere, which I think is a part of what lends itself towards this totalitarian fascist unity, so to speak. And I see that happening, and I see that primarily driven actually by corporations, and the corporations control a lot of the world downward through their impact on government and things like that. And so and when I say corporations, I mean big tech also, right? Like the big tech agendas, and all of the big tech platforms, and how the people who control the world are trying to get us to be less in possession of our own volitions and more subscribed to them in any number of ways. We're already seeing this transition over the years with, for example, back in the day, we used to own our own music, right? We would have CDs and we would have vinyl records and we would have all of that stuff. These days, it's Spotify or something like that. So we don't own the music anymore as something tangible. We subscribe. The same thing could be said for all of the programs that we used to use, like Photoshop. We used to buy Photoshop, and now we subscribe to Photoshop, right? Netflix. We used to have DVDs. Now we don't have DVDs anymore. Now we subscribe to Netflix or whatever. And this idea of us owning less and less and less is also starting to take over, where we will be renting everything at some point from corporations that control all the resources. And I also see how these corporations have modulated the public agendas in ways that are very subversive and covert to facilitate their agenda. That's what I think is happening. At the same time, I see pockets of revolution against this inside what we might call the spiritual communities, broadly speaking, in which I would put in also like mind-body therapy, just people who are focused more on consciousness and on the human potential. I do see these pockets of revolution pulling up, and yet at the same time, I think that in the grand scheme of things, that's still the minority. Yeah. So at least this is in the modern world, because there are still other countries on Earth that are not very involved in all of this still. They're still living their more traditional ways of life. They're not as deeply impacted as we are living in modern. I don't know. What do you think? What's your perspective on it?
I mean, I'm kind of intrigued just because we're having this conversation, because you're working in shamanism a lot. Like, what do spiritual entities think about this shit? Like the world changing and stuff. Because I don't know, it just came up for me. Like, I mean, I was in Africa like 25 years ago. I was doing, I did Iboga initiation, Bwiti in Cameroon, and heavy fucking shit. But like,
Yeah.
on some part of that, it's a very big visionary stage, because Iboga stays in your body a long time and you're out of it for like hours, days, and I could see people, and they were kind of, it was like a futurist thing, like a bit out of William Gibson or something like that, one of these futurist writers who's like, they got augmented kind of parts of them that are like, they're part human, part cyborg and shit. And I know, in like, if you look at a lot of ayahuasca stuff, you often see those similar kind of images of technology integrated a bit with humanity. So I don't know, it's kind of an interesting field. It does seem like a lot of shit is changing. I have a sense that there's like some kind of big primal push, being working with the body. I'm used to the idea, but like the body sometimes pushing up, it's trying to get something out, and the mind is kind of like, no, fuck this, and it's pushing down, and there's this conflict going on. And it feels a little bit like that in the world, but there's some deep level of change trying to happen. And then a lot of the established kind of power bases, hierarchical control kind of stuff, if it's corporations, nation states, whatever, they're kind of scrabbling around trying to push down a little bit or control. It's like there's definitely something like that going on, but I don't know. I mean, I've been involved in spiritual stuff and with shamanic stuff a little bit, Rosicrucian things and that, and I'm familiar with some of the tuning in practices, but I don't really know where any of this shit is going, and we may even be coming out of a phase. Like, for a long time, the whole thing was like, you vision what the future should be, and then you move in that direction. You make, whether it's for yourself or for your community or for the world or whatever. You have a vision and then you move towards the vision. And I don't know if it's still like that. Maybe we're just tech or whatever has hit a point where shit can just emerge, and just happen. And it's less about this kind of mental level of control, where you create a vision of what the world should be like, and then you try and create it. You know what I mean? So I don't have a
Yeah,
clear impression. I've been freaking out a lot. I mean, part of why I left the UK a few years ago was just like I thought, God, there's so much fucking propaganda here. I mean, I'd wanted to
yeah,
travel for a while, and I was just with this girlfriend, then we split up. So it was easy for me to get off and travel again, which I'd done before I'd been in spiritual community and stuff. But like, it was also partly because I just felt like such a fucking cloud of propaganda all the time, in the UK. I just wanted to get out of that a bit and get my head a bit clearer. But what am I trying to say here? But I did. So I mean, I've been freaking out about stuff, but then I kind of freak out for a while, whether it's about something to do with COVID or something to do with the wars going on or whatever. But then it kind of something processes for me. I don't seem to get caught up in it. I don't get caught up in a lot of heavy emotions for a long period of time, maybe a month or two, and then it kind of moves through. And I have this sense like, I don't know, there's a transition. I'm in a bit of a process with it all, but I don't really know where it's going. And it is maybe we're going in a really bad fucking direction, or maybe we're going apocalyptic, or maybe the apocalypse is even what's meant to happen, or who the fuck knows? It's like I don't know. I'm open to different ideas, but I don't have a clear impression of what the future might look like.
yeah. Well, you speaking, like, there's a bunch of different things that came up for me. So I wanted to address one thing from the beginning that you were talking about, which was, how do spiritual entities feel about these changes? I think it very much depends on which spiritual entities you're talking to, right? I think there are some, like, for example, the ancestors. As far as I can tell, when you step back just even a couple hundred years and you get into the deeper ancestral layers, these beings, in my impression of it, in general, are trying to call us back to a more primal relationship to reality, right? Like, there's this almost like a little bit of a break system, like, slow down.
Mm-hmm.
We have to stabilize some of these deeper ancestral patterns and bring them into the shift that's occurring, right? Which is just wanting to happen too fast, for the integrity of the human organism, right? One example of that is squatting. Like squatting, like a flat-footed squat. It is something that is a foundational human posture and position that is a part of the human structure as much as walking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's completely gone in most places of modern civilization, right? So it's like, that's a small example that we could apply to any number of aspects of the human experience. There's all these things that are coming from the ancestral that we have inherited over hundreds of thousands of years that are literally a part of being human, that are being cut away, like carved out of the system, just to fit the propaganda, as you were saying. And so, as far as I can tell, like, hey, slow down. A lot of this stuff, is too fast, too soon. And then you have all these different nature spirits and natural forces that are also not about it. But then you also, as far as I can tell, there are one might say inauspicious uh, spiritual influences in the world, the types of things that exist in corporate boardrooms, talking about tearing down entire rainforest or subjugating entire populations of people in order to gain profit, whatever. And it doesn't matter if they're children or not. Like, spiritual forces exist in those places too, right? And those types of beings, depending on, you talk to them, they might be a little bit more for the agenda. Also, I think it's really cool that you were saying that for you, you might get caught up in a lot of this stuff for a little bit, but then it just like dissipates. And I think that's because, you have an anchor. You have an anchor, which is, your physical experience. And a lot of people today, they're kind of like buoys in the sea, just being tossed about by all of these forces because they don't have an anchor point. They can't stabilize into a sense of individual experience, right? Self. And with that, it's so easy to get swept up in the propaganda, right? And I do agree with you also that there's this revolting happening from the body. And I'm writing a book right now called "In Praise of the Wild Spirit," and it's basically talking about how the that the baseline human state that the baseline state really is wildness, right? The storms on Mars are wild, right? The solar flares are wild, right? And we evolved in a wild context. And over the last few thousand years, there's these domesticated forces that are trying to control and commodify us, right? And a big part of how they do that is through their propaganda. And it doesn't matter if they're religious or they're corporate or whatever. And that there's this emergence happening of the wild spirit. And so that's what the book is about. And so I would totally agree that there is this type of movement happening, that it's something primal that's saying fuck all of this. And yeah, so that's what you said brought up a lot for me.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I guess it just for me, it's like when kind of COVID started, it was like the world's getting more exciting again as well. I had this feeling being about 60 at the time. And it was curious because for a long time I was focused on this date 2020, It was in my brain since even before, I don't know, back in the 90s, that I should write a book called 2020. But
Hmm.
I never did. But like, when that started to kick off with COVID, and you could see it was going to go deep, it's like, okay, like some kind of roller coaster is starting. This is kind of exciting because I definitely had a feeling like before then, like, oh my God, like, it's just been 30 years of, as a Westerner, super stability and just getting more and more kind of dull, comfort based. People are just getting fatter. Everyone's just concerned about, they're just worried about their fucking tax bracket. They find something to worry about, but it's increasingly abstract because all their daily needs in the West were taken care of. And then when COVID came and these changes come, a part of me is like, yeah, fuck yeah. It's like, a part of me is because it's like life is not just about being fucking comfortable and
Hmm.
just continuing on, it's like something else is coming in, so even though I get thrown around, I've been reading a guy called Nick Land a lot recently, a crazy guy from back in the 90s, British philosopher who's one of the cyberspace guys originally, and like there's some really crazy shit in that, but like, and apocalyptic stuff and all sorts of weird heavy stuff, but like it's like I need this shaking up, I need this shaking up, and then my perception is but a lot of other people, it's good for them too, like
Hmm.
I'm just putting the final touches on a book on anxiety that I've been writing the last 6 months. And one of my big takes is like so many people out in the world are like, we need to reduce stress. The level of change going on in the world is too much for the average human nervous system. And so the change needs to slow down, which I get and understand. But the other side is, we can also increase resilience. Instead of making the world has to change, it's more like, okay, I need to increase my level of resilience. How can I do that? And that's the other side because anyway, I don't think it's going to get stuck in some kind of super safety thing anyway, because this world is just changing too fast. But the danger is that people just get obsessed with safety and feeling safe, and then they get less resilient because they're not getting challenges. So then they need to feel more safe. So then they vote for even more kind of political, social, technological control, and it just goes in a kind of feedback loop like that until everyone's just living in a complete 24/7 kind of social credit, computer driven state, I don't know, but like, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that like I think that there's a big shakeup happening right now is also good, but of course it's also scary, and it's scary for me too, but I think underneath it kind of has to happen. There's that sense
Yeah.
for me, you know. Some every now and again, like when I used to do therapy, when I started doing therapy, I was like in my late 30s, and I went to a few low level things in London. And then I got a connection to the Human University in Holland, which was very full on in those days, you know, days without sleeping and just really intense group therapy practice, full on shit, you know, from this guy Varesh, you know, passed away now, but like brilliant, amazing therapist and really from the streets completely. And like, and you're just thrown, you know, and I would find the group sometimes a fucking torture, you know, like never sleeping, feedback, crazy structures all the time, screaming and shouting, and all of this mad stuff. And at the same time, I could recognize I need to fucking do this, you know, I need to fucking do this. I need something to shake me up because otherwise my life is going, you know, is going down, you know, it's getting fucked over. So I think now when I see the world, you know, all this change happening and people freaking out, it's like also on some level that also has to happen. You know, it also has to happen. And there are individual tragedies around which are horrible, you know, but it's like it also somewhere has to happen somehow.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said for sure. It's interesting. Just before I address a little bit more, just it was interesting because I was living when COVID started. I was living in the wilderness at a wolf sanctuary, completely divorced from civilization, so to speak, and going through some very intense experiences, not having amenities and comforts at all. So you know, when COVID came, it just like it didn't do the same thing it did, I think, for a lot of people who were not in that type of experience, you know, for me. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I never really thought about it that way. But yeah, so in regards to what you were saying, I totally agree that that type of initiatory experience has to happen for human beings in some form or fashion, right? What you were talking about in that group sounds to me like a lot of what you encounter in indigenous traditions when it comes to initiations, which are usually very challenging, very tough. They take you to the edge of what you think is possible, and there's generally some kind of death and rebirth process that occurs, right? Like that's built into the human experience. And so I agree that it does have to happen somewhere, right? Um, and that we're actually seeking it out at some level, whether we recognize it or not. People are seeking out that type of experience. And I do find it really interesting and insightful though, that you said that, you know, because people's nervous systems get put into this place of, you know, uh, fear and we need more safety, that they project that out into the environment and to try to create these safety bubbles instead of becoming more resilient. You know, it's interesting. I don't think the stress really goes away. I think it just changes form, changes shape, right? So, you know, like a person who's thriving, usually they're under a lot of stress. It's just stress that's good for them. You know what I mean? It's the stress of like doing important work, or the stress of having really important like physical practices that they're doing, and meditative practices, and engaged in community, and all that's stressful, right? All that is like demand that's being placed upon you. It's just different than the stress, let's say, of working at a job you hate and like sitting on a couch for you know for 30 hours a week, or eating crappy food, which is also stressful, right? So it's like stress doesn't go away, it just changes form, you know. And more so, I think that what's healthier for people is to consciously choose their stresses as much as possible, right? And because the right stresses and the right amount are what make you resilient, right? Whereas, you know, the wrong, quote unquote, and I'm using that word because I don't have a better example, but or a better word, but the wrong stresses in the wrong dosages are what make you terrified and weak and sitting in, you know, on your couch hoping that the world takes care of you, right? So it's kind of like it's really about being able to manage the stress instead of removing the stress, in my view, anyway. Yeah.
Mm, I guess, you know, my take is these days, you know, it's a lot about feeling your body more. It's a lot about feeling your back more. It's a lot about feeling your belly more, you know, and then you have like a safe haven inside of yourself that you can go to when the stress is hitting you hard. And if you don't have that sense of your body so deep, then it's much harder. You have to try and control more. You have to kind of project more into the need of the government to take care of you or whatever, you know.
Mm. Yeah, that's solid. Simple and true. Yeah. It's one of the first things that like almost every client I get gets sent your belly activation videos, gets sent your bow and the arch videos. Yeah, pretty much just about everybody gets that. The one thing that I add, which I don't know if you've created a video yet on it, is the orientating position, just the basic orientating stance from bioenergetics to like activate the legs. I put together a video for that, but everything else is usually your stuff to get the belly activated, to get the bow and the arch dynamics going on, and to get the legs activated. I mean, that's like baseline for just about everybody I get, because everybody I get needs that. Yeah. So thank you, by the way, because your YouTube videos have made my job a lot easier. You know, I can just send people your stuff and be like, "Hey guys, do this in these amounts and these ways." And yeah, totally agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to look up this video on your channel, this
I haven't
orientating thing, you know.
I haven't put it on the channel. I'm gonna put it on my Substack soon, actually.
Okay.
I was gonna make an article called the Bioenergetic Big Three, I call it. That's like my language for it, but it's the orientating
Hmm.
stance and then the bow and the arch. And I was gonna put your bow and the arch videos, which is funny because when you messaged me to do the podcast, I was in the process of creating the article that has two of your videos in it, of like the
Okay.
bow and the arch. That I was gonna add my video two on the Substack, and like it's how I orientate clients to do like this bioenergetic big three. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's
Yeah, cool. I mean, it's just good that this work gets out there a bit, you know. I never have much expectation that it'll become huge, though of course you never know. But like, it's just good that it gets out there and it can reach people. You know, it changed my life. You know, the fact that there were these Osho therapists around 25 years ago, and I got into contact with them. I don't think without that connection, you know, I would probably be dead by now or something. You know, it's like the way my life was going. So, you know, it's just good that this work can still be out there and that kind of thing. So, hey, thank you for coming on this occasional show. Anyway, Ramon, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you and meet you, man. And do you have anything else you'd like to put out? We can put some links in the description below as to where people can check out what you're up to.
yeah, no, it's been a pleasure, and like I said, you know, your work has been really important to me, and it's been, if I didn't have your work, I'm certain I would not be as embodied or as healthy as I am today, you know.
Hmm.
So I really appreciate what you've put out there and that you have been able to do what you've done. And yeah, it's awesome because you're the only person who's still doing bioenergetics uh, to the degree that I have seen it, at least in the popular internet sphere, that makes it accessible for people. So it's a real gift. So thank you for putting that out there.
Thank you. Hey,
Yeah.
thank you, Ramon. You just